brief. I want to say welcome. I'm glad you're here again. Bring somebody back next Sunday night, next Sunday morning as well. Let's bow together for a word of prayer, and then we'll turn it over to Tim. Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to be together tonight. Bless us, Lord, as we consider the grand history and heritage of our church in order that we might be captured by your vision for our future as well. We offer you our prayer and our time together in the name of Christ. Amen.
One of two things happened last week. Either I didn't bore you, or I didn't bore you enough that it was enough to keep you from coming tonight. Thank you for coming back. Those of you who are here for the first time. What we're trying to do here is tell a series of stories, because history is nothing more than stories. History is a series of tales, hopefully not fables as it has been written, but it is a series of tales. Tonight we're going to continue, but I do want to go back. Last week I think did the Federal Express commercial, the guy that talks really fast near the end of the thing. So if I lost you the last 5 minutes as I was trying to get to a certain stopping point, several things happened at Loray Baptist Church during the First World War. First of all, the mills were running at full capacity to produce goods for the Allies as they were winning the victory over Germany. The community was full of people. And this is the thing I want you to do. I need to tell you to do this again if you've forgotten. You need to wipe everything out of your mind as far as your ideas of what Gastonia is. Nothing much was here, but the central city where most of the affluent folks lived and the large homes were, and then the suburban areas which were nothing but mill villages and farms. So if you think of Gastonia as being anything else, there were no malls, there were no Interstate 85s. In fact, at the point we've reached here, they just cut Franklin from town through to the Loray Mill Village. So we're talking about an area that is growing, it is vital, it is vibrant, there's much excitement, there's much enthusiasm. It is an adventure for many of the folks who were a part of that. A lot of the folks, as we said last week, had been brought from the labor agents would go and bring folks in who were tired of scraping a living out on small farms in the mountains and the counties to the west of Gaston County. They worked their way all the way into the mountains, and some of you probably have maybe either you came from or some of your father's mother's, someone came from North Georgia. So what we did basically is exhaust the labor pool from all around here. There were many, many people. The majority of those folks were Baptists. The majority of them were Baptists, and so they were here, and they were lending as time passed, and as this area grew, and as textiles continued to chug along as the engine that fueled that drove the economy of Gaston County. A lot of these folks had their ties in some way to Loray Baptist Church, and we beat ourselves up, and we've done this over the past 15, 20 years. We beat ourselves up because of the fact that the church is not as large as it used to be, and we look at some of C.J. Black's pictures of the classes and the church, the Sunday school, and we say, man, look how big we were. We must not be doing something right, because we ought to be that big today. We were the only Baptist church west of the central city, and this was the most populous area of Gastonia. And most of these folks who lived here were Baptist. So it was almost like shooting fish in a barrel. All you had to do pretty much as the church grew and as the community grew was to have church and call it Baptist, and you pretty much would have a full house. And so this is what was taking place. And imagine the throngs of people. The area that we refer to today as Greasy Corner was the Loray Business District, and it was almost as full of people on the weekend as the downtown area, or in those days called the uptown area. It's like when it went down, they started calling it downtown. But when it was called uptown, it was full on Saturdays, and so was the area that we refer to today. It was called Loray Square, but today we call it Greasy Corner. and that place was full of people. World War I, when that war, which was of short duration as far as the United States involvement in that, Loray Baptist Church was right here in the middle of the effort to make things better for the servicemen. For about 6 weeks, and that's about all that operated. Camp Chronicle down on Linwood Road, there's a monument down there near the food line. It operated there, and there were like 1,600 cavalry, 900 infantry, and from 75 to 100 men from the Signal Corps who trained down there for 6 weeks during early 1918. There was, on March 24, 1918, Loray Baptist Church observed Soldiers' Day, and Reverend Abernathy preached on the Bible, the war, and your country. And many of the soldiers from Camp Chronicle supposedly came to Loray Baptist Church. And you can imagine the doughboys with the broad brim hats and the riding breeches and all of this picturesque uniforms marching into the church before the worship service that day. There was also a canvas scroll that was displayed in the Berean class during the war that contained on it the names of the servicemen from West Gastonia who were serving in the Army or the Navy during this period of time. Now, you might ask, as I've asked many times, where did it go? Who knows? There's no mention of it except that one time that it was displayed there. At the end of the war, everyone, the mill whistles were blowing, and every person, the Gastonia Gazette, the Gastonia Daily Gazette stated that every man who owned a rifle was out firing it. And a couple days later in the Gazette it said all those who have claims for damages need to come to City Hall next week. And so apparently there was a lot of shooting going on. Immediately following the war, as often happens following wartime situations, there was a recession, a post-war depression economically. Things sort of declined a bit in the church. There was, however, a revival meeting shortly after the church sanctuary was elevated so that folks could see and hear better. There was a revival, and during that time there were approximately 73 additions to the church at that point in time. So, and then exit George Abernathy and enter someone who the likes of which has not been seen unto this day, and that is Reverend later Dr. Charles Jefferson Black. C.J. Black, and he's probably one of the, you might know someone who remembers him vaguely, but he would come into the worship service sometimes singing, as some of the older members who have now departed this earth. He would come into the pulpit and he would be singing, "I am bound for the promised land." He was somewhat of a showman. That's not taking away any of his spirituality, but he was someone who played it for what it was worth. He took what he had and he made it look even bigger than what it was. And he did that so that the church would grow and so that he used publicity. Most of the pictures that you've seen and most of the pictures that we beat ourselves up with saying we ought to be that big today, those were pictures that I don't see how they got a lot of church done, because it was almost as if, come on folks, we're going to take a picture. And so many of the pictures were taken down in the old playground area with a fisheye lens, taken across Loray, later Firestone Boulevard, but the fisheye lens would come around, and as you can see the back in a lot of these, the back of the dormitories. So you've got a 90-degree angle here. So a lot of these pictures were C.J. Black's pictures. This is what was happening in Gastonia at the time. The Manimal Jenks Company of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, had purchased the Loray Mill in 1920 from the Moore interest of Welford, South Carolina, Spartanburg County. In 1921, a large addition to the mill was constructed on the west side, and that's the part over here that goes back. The original mill was just the main structure. The part that does the curve and goes back was done in 21. It was a large addition, 6 stories on the west side, 100 feet by 140 feet, and a basement was dug under the 5-story building that was already here. And the manufactured product was changed to tire cord. And that's, of course, what the mill was until it closed down. 1,700 people were on the payroll, and there were from 5,000 to 6,000 village residents. And there was $1 million spent on improvements to the mill and the village during this time. You have all this taking place, there were up to a total of 600 houses were built in the Loray Mill Village. You have all these new people coming in, and then you have C.J. Black waltzing, and I'm sure he didn't waltz, but C.J. Black walking into the middle of this, and the majority of these folks were Baptists. He did church as he did church, and the crowds came. West Gastonia, which was primarily this area, the Arlington, the Gray Mill, and some others that were being built during this time. The population of Gastonia itself, Greater Gastonia, was 12,871 people. 5,000 to 6,000 of them were here. So when you think about that, the numbers of people, the vast majority of them being Baptist, it's no wonder Monroe was the largest church and boasted during this time of having possibly the largest Sunday school in the state of North Carolina, one of the largest in the Southern Baptist Convention. During this time, during the 20s, Franklin Avenue had just been paved. Prior to it being paved on this end of town, it was, as I understand, paved with cinders. They had to do something with the coal that was burned in the boilers at the mills. So what they did with them was dump them on the streets. And I remember growing up over at the Trenton Mill, there was a little road in the back that still, until they finally paved it, was probably one of the last little roads, little streets in town that had cinders on it, because I remember falling on a bicycle in those things, and it wasn't a lot of fun. They paved Franklin during this time. The business area on this end of town was booming. The People's Bank was established in July of 1920. The directors of that bank included J.M. Gilliam and D.A. Grigg, who were prominent members of Loray Baptist Church. They were grocers, and Mrs. Grigg led the WMU for many, many years, one of the prime movers of that organization. The businesses included, and is Walt Blanton here? Is Walt here tonight? I don't have the date of when D.W. Blanton and Sons Grocery was organized, but it was not listed during a Gastonia Gazette article in February 1920 said that several new businesses in the Loray area included Nesbitt and Gilliam Grocers, the Loray Drugstore, Settlemyer Furniture, the Hub Clothing Store, the R.A. Baker Dry Goods. And it said there are numerous other business establishments in the Loray section, and many Loray members owned those businesses or had interest in those businesses. So the church was in this setting. The war was over. Prosperity was coming back. Northern interest had once again bought the mill. Things had started rolling once again. And in steps C.J. Black. He was a people person. It was said of him that he would shout at people all the time. You'd be on the parsonage. You remember from last week, the parsonage was where this parking lot is to the west of the church. And so it faced Franklin. It faced all this business district up and down the street here, people coming and going all the time. And he was there, if he wasn't shouting at somebody, he was inviting himself to dinner. I'll see you Sunday. Have dinner with me. Yeah, I'll be there. And he would either be doing that, talking to someone. He would be stopping people on the street, talking to them, inviting them to church. He was out moving among the people here, and he was well liked. He was well liked. Folks would come to church because they liked to come to church in that time. He had to deal with the problem of a transient membership, however. You look at the numbers and you wonder if you had these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people coming through this church, and then you finally wind up that after records were cleaned up during the beginning of this pastorate, membership stood at about 1,200 members. But you see figures like 1,000, 2,000, 2,500, you say, wait a minute, all of those don't add up to 1,200 members. Well, first of all, you didn't have to be a member of the church to be a member of the Sunday school. And the Sunday school included the ladies' classes, the matrons class, the Fidelis class, that you had your primaries, your juniors, your intermediate departments. And then you had all adult males, all males over, I think, the age of 18 were in the Berean class. And the Berean class is one of the largest Sunday school classes around. And this is the famous or infamous picture. This is one of the things that we've all seen. Many of us have seen this. If you've been at Loray any length of time, or you've had grandparents or great-grandparents or somebody who maybe went here, these things are still showing up in people's attics. These things are still showing up. Usually they're rolled up. There's a whole filing cabinet drawer full of this picture rolled up in there. If you find any more, they're not making any more of them, so bring them to us. We're collecting. But these are here, and C.J. Black was doing this constantly. He was trooping the people out so that, because it's like anything else, if you want people to think, or want people to want to be a part of something, you at least give them the idea that something is going on, and they'll come and be a part of it, or they'll at least come and see what is going on. C.J. Black strengthened the church as it had not been strengthened before. He built on George Abernathy's work and all of those pastors who came before him. And none of them were of lesser importance than the one following him, because they all took what had come to them and built upon it. So when the next one got there, whether membership was up or down, he was able to take a church that had a bit more maturity and had been through some difficult times and was able to proceed with it. Black was a teacher at heart. He brought in some of the greatest minds in Sunday school work. He brought in, there was constant training going on. The Sunday school membership grew to over 2,000 members as a result of this, and was one of the largest in North Carolina and one of the largest in the Southern Baptist Convention. The Berean class was a unique sort of situation. It was a social club. It was a Sunday school class. It was an insurance company. And it was whatever else it needed to be. Oftentimes, if someone had medical bills they couldn't pay, a hat would be passed in the Berean class. And with the size of that class, they were able to take care of each other. So the Berean class was there, and it was a thing that men wanted to be a part of. And to say that it was just that people are less spiritual today, that might be true, but I would dare say that a lot of and some of you were in the Berean class. And the Berean class was something that you came to because that's where everybody was on Sunday morning. And not to take away the spiritual benefits of coming. But it was a positive, it was a force in the community. It had its own orchestra. And your grandfather played cornet in the orchestra, and some of your folks may have played instruments in that. They did things that we would look at possibly a fraternal order doing today, or a social type club. And this is not to take away from the Berean class. It grew so much under the leadership of C.J. Black and several presidents, including Greg McCarver. Greg McCarver just happened to be at the right place at the right time, and he was the one who was in all these pictures as the president of the Berean class. So he was president during C.J. Black's tenure, which we can say Greg McCarver was one of the moving forces behind the Berean class. Took a lot of people to make it work, a lot of organization. The Berean class caused all of this stuff back here. The church, as I pointed out to you last week, the church, here's Franklin. Well, here's Franklin. Well, imagine, here's Franklin. Here is Millen Street. Over here is 2nd Avenue. Right here is the Southern Railway switch track that went across from the main line. You had, since Franklin had been paved, the P&N, the Piedmont Northern Electric Railroad, which came and cut in and went over, and before 2nd or right near 2nd joined onto the southern spur line. And in the middle of all this, you had Loray Baptist Church, pretty well hemmed in. So what happened as the Berean class continued to grow, there wasn't anywhere to put them, so they continued to build on and build on. They built 3 additions, and then they had to dig basements under those additions as they needed more and more space. For a time, the Berean class met in West School, later Abernathy School, but they always had a home at Loray Baptist Church, and the Berean class was the primary reason for all of these additions and all of this crazy quilt roof line that you see here. If you look closely, you can see that this is Franklin. Over here is where the church is now. This is Millen Street. Here's 2nd Avenue. This is the southern line. Over here is the P&M Railroad, which comes behind here. And most of that triangle was filled with buildings and basements under those buildings. This was not a boring place to be. I wasn't here, but from everything I've heard, I've read over the past 17 years, this was an end of town where some things were happening. There was, however, as I said earlier, a huge transient membership. The mills would often swap people. You would have someone who would work over here, they'd work at the Trenton a while, they'd work at the Gray a while, they'd work at Arlington a while, they'd be at the Loray a while, and wherever. Folks would move around. And so to have this kind of growth, this kind of organization, and all of this taking place during the time of all this transiency was a miracle in itself. C.J. Black was some, and those who, the few older folks that I've talked with who remember him, say that he was just a wonderful, wonderful pastor. The final expansion of Loray Baptist Church was the 3rd of these additions for the Berean class. Loray Baptist Church, as it stood until the day it was torn down, contained 19,115 square feet of floor space, 2 auditoriums and 25 classrooms, and the main auditorium would seat a maximum of 1,200 people, like sardines. But this was the size of the church. During the pastorate, motor vehicles were first used, and there was what might be called a bus ministry. In around 1923-24, there was a flatbed truck. Now imagine what the insurance people would do with this today. There was a flatbed truck with seats on it, and they'd go around. There's a sign here that they're holding. It says, Loray Baptist Sunday School, children hop on. And they drove up and down the streets of the mill villages, and parents would either put their kids up, or if they were big enough, the children would jump on it, and it had a canvas cover over it for rainy days. It's sort of like a jelly bean covered with ants, actually, is what it looks like. But if you look, you can sort of see the outline of the truck behind all these children. So I thought that was rather interesting. And that is there's a picture of that in the history as well. And that's kind of neat. James Hill, Lawrence, South Carolina. You wonder why a lot of these folks sort of shifted around within the same area. Into South Carolina, into Spartanburg, Greenville County, up into to Gaston County, and generally sometimes over into Rutherford County. The textile industry had a tendency to swap pastors. You would look around and say, oh yeah, he was at that mill church, he was at that mill village for a while and served really well, let's call him. And so if you read the histories of all these churches, you see that the same names keep coming up. J.A. Boyle was everywhere. In fact, my mother just brought me somewhere here is a little history in the Gazette, I believe, about Riverview Baptist Church in Lincoln County, and the grandson of J.A. Boyle, great-grandson of J.A. Boyle, is the pastor there now. He was the founding pastor of that church. So he was everywhere, and he basically went where the mills were, and that's the reason you see the same names showing up. R.F. Littlejohn succeeded L.J. Waldrop as a chorister and continued the music tradition that even that early was building at Loray Church. You had the Berean class for men, the TEL class for married women, with Timothy, Eunice, and Lois, and the Fidelis class for single women. Now, the TEL class is still around, so that's pretty good. And you've got the Berean class, if you still call it that, the oldest class, the most mature class of men is the Berean class. While at Loray, I don't have a copy of the other one. Ray Barnes can show you the other one if you'd like to see it. We've got a photocopy of it. But C.J. Black authored 2 books, and occasionally, if you ever at a flea market or something, and you see anything by C.J. Black, the history of Loray Baptist Church and the origin of Baptist. The origin of the Baptist. Got an interesting scholarly approach to proving how the 12 apostles were Baptist. It's sort of interesting. But if you ever find any of these, we're looking for those. There's not making any more of those either. He also, during this time, wrote the history of Sandy Plains Baptist Church. You'll see that the pastor for some time, I believe through part of Whitley's pastorate, they were also pastor of Sandy Plains. Sandy Plains was like a part-time pastorate thing. So if you came to Loray, you also, for some reason, got Sandy Plains. And I don't know if that was just a coincidence that those two served like that, but for at least part of those 2 pastorates, the Loray pastor was also the full-time pastor here, part-time pastor there. That happened quite a bit. Reverend Black closed his pastor at the end of December 1924, became pastor of the First Baptist Church of Kings Mountain. And he said, while he also wrote the history of Kings Mountain First Baptist Church, and he said he left Loray because it was too much work for him to do any longer, and he just couldn't do it anymore. So he went to Kings Mountain because it looked like sort of an easy place to go. And he wrote that he was mistaken in his history. So if you're ever in the Kings Mountain Library, there's a copy of that there. If you have any interest, maybe after you've gone and looked at the dam on the creek down here, and you've gone up to White Jenkins Road and waded in the pond where Black Walter was baptized, you might want to go over to Kings Mountain today. You might see me there. On January 24, 1925, Loray Baptist Church extended the pastoral call to Julius W. Whitley, who returned to Gastonia. He had been pastor of East Baptist Church, and if you go inside of East Baptist Church and look at the large stained glass window, there's a plaque underneath that dedicating that to Dr. and Mrs. I think he was Reverend and Mrs. Whitley. So he was the one who led their church into the building of their main building, their sanctuary there. He was no stranger to Gastonia, having been here before. He was a towering man. I've heard folks say that he was quite an imposing figure. And someone, I don't know if this is true or not, but someone said at some point in his early life he was a baseball player, or a semi-pro baseball player, or whatever. I've heard one person say that he thought he was early on a pretty good baseball player. He was a tall figure of man. We've got some pictures of him with hair, which is interesting as well. He served longer than any pastor until Reverend White came. He served longer than any pastor at Loray Baptist Church. He served from 1925 until 1941. The history is incorrect there, but we've corrected that. He's the oldest member, the oldest pastor or pastorate remembered by many of the members here. How many of you remember Dr. Whitley? Raise your hand if you remember Dr. Whitley. Okay. Everybody used to remember Dr. Whitley. That means something. I don't know what that means. It might mean time's passing. But Dr. Whitley came to Loray, and he had prior to that been at Murfreesboro, North Carolina. He had built the parsonage and led them in building the new sanctuary there. He was also, during that time, impressive credentials, the most educated pastor to ever hit Loray up to that time. He was at a time the dean of Chowan College during part of this term. Had some differences of opinion with the board of whatever, the ones that control the school, and left that. But he was raised as a Lutheran. He converted to the Baptist faith as an early teenager. He attended Wake Forest College, where he earned a degree in law. He attended the Rochester Divinity School in Rochester, New York. Studied under Dr. Augustus Hopkins Strong, who was the leading Baptist theologian of that day. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in theology. From there, he went to the University of Chicago, where he earned his PhD degree. He was engaged for a time in the teaching of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And he came to Loray Baptist Church. And that's rather amazing. He was here working among textile workers. A man of this intellect, a man of this education was here. He was a stern disciplinarian. If you didn't attend church for 1 year, you were dismissed, unless you were hindered by health reasons. As a result, church membership was often less than Sunday school membership. You wonder why. When he arrived at Loray, he came in and built on C.J. Black's foundation. And although he was not the same personality of C.J. Black, he was as goal-oriented as Black was, if not more so. He came in, continued the training, brought in some of the greatest minds at that time in Sunday school and church training or training union work. And he arrived and found this core of trained people ready to do the Lord's work here. He also found a leaky roof, which seems to sort of go along with Loray Baptist Church. For the entire history of the church, the roof is leaked. So it might be a good thing that ours still does that to this day. A proud tradition carried on. Also, debts of $3,000, which if you'll imagine that check old pay envelopes at this time, and $8 to $10 a week might be the pay for a textile worker. And you look at that, and you look at a $3,000 debt, and the church had been spending some money. He immediately went to work, organized the church financially. The church was able to pay off its debts. The BYPU was reorganized. The Sunday school was reorganized to be a first-class Sunday school. Everything was updated. Went on a rotating program of deacon succession, although you look at the deacon, the history of the deacon board at Loray Baptist Church is rather interesting because it's taken 2 full circles during the history of the church. It started out right here, as most Baptist churches were. You were chosen by the pastor generally, and you were a deacon for life. And then as time went on, the deacons chose deacons, and it was succession that went on until somebody died and then a new deacon was chosen. They eventually went to a point where you had under Whitley's pastorate rotation. You had 21 deacons, 7 serving at a term. It was still a closed situation. It was not until after World War II that Loray Baptist Church elected deacons, and I would imagine that was a trend that was sweeping across the Southern Baptist Convention as we see a lot of these things taking place. We turn now to the darkest, one of the darkest, if not the darkest period in the history of Gastonia, North Carolina. And to this day, you'll look in, I have a train tour book, a train guidebook telling you about Amtrak and telling you about cities on certain routes that you will pass through. And this was published in like 1983, 84. And it says, you will leave Charlotte and you will shortly pass through the textile town or the textile city of Gastonia, the scene of a bloody strike in 1929. Not that we were an all-American city in 1964, not that we had led the nation in race relations and the ease at which things took place, all the pluses, all the things that were positive about Gastonia, but the bloody strike had taken place here in 1929. 2 people were killed. There was a bloody strike that took place here. What happened was this. Let me tell you one more thing before we get to that. Jumping ahead of myself here. January 8, 1928, Loray voted after the morning worship service to sponsor a Boy Scout troop. They picked up the tenure of a troop that had existed in the community for several years, since 1920, and decided to do that. That was Troop 9, which is still with us today, and I was proud to be a part of that troop for some time. We have leaders of that troop, Scoutmaster, Assistant Scoutmaster, some committee people around here. Some of you know the glorious history of that troop. You might not know, though, that somebody didn't want it. Okay? Somebody didn't want it. And the story was that the pastor said, "Do I hear a motion that we adopt a Boy Scout troop?" And somebody said, "I make that motion." He said, "Do I hear a second?" And there was silence. Now you got Dr. Whitley standing. I don't know whether Dr. Whitley didn't like it or whether somebody else in the church or maybe the majority of the church might not have liked it. A 17-year-old boy, the way I get the story, and I think that 17-year-old boy, I'm not sure the age and if it checks out, but I believe it was John Long, a 17-year-old boy, as he has been identified, raised his hand, said, "Dr. Whitley, sir, may I second that motion?" He said, "You're a member of the church, you can do anything anyone else can." And he said, "I second that motion." And Troop 9, Boy Scouts of America, the second oldest troop in the Piedmont Council of the Boy Scouts of America, and one of the probably, I think, 15, 20 oldest Baptist church units in the nation, still meets on Monday nights right over here. Thanks to a 17, don't ever sell yourself short, a 17-year-old person, a young person, can make a big difference and last a long, long time. What happened in 1920 was the time that Loray Mill had been sold to the Jinx Spinning Company. What had happened in 1923 was that the Manual Company and the Jinx Company merged, and that created a chain of textile mills that included 9 mills. 7 of them were in New England, in Rhode Island. 1 of them was at High Shoals, and the other one was the Loray. The Loray was the most profitable mill. Because of all the financial hardships that have been placed on that company, because of the merger, they had to do all sorts of efficiency measures. They did what was commonly termed as a stretch out, which meant that a worker had to work more machines and had to do more work in less time. It was looked at as just an efficiency measure. It wasn't a sinister, diabolical thing. But to the textile workers, they were the ones, it's like any of us today who have been through mergers, we know that we have to do twice the amount of work with no more pay. And you don't like it, but you do it because that's what you do for a living. But the Textile Workers Union of America, which was a communist-backed union, came in. You know the story. There have been a multitude of books written about it. They're in the public library. They're in the Waldo Books, B. Dalton. All of these bookstores have copies of it. Some of the folks sitting here tonight have copies of it. What happened? They came in, agitated people. The entire mill emptied out at first. Most people went back to their jobs. Governor Max Gardner of Shelby called out the National Guard from Shelby and other places, came to the mill here. You've all seen the pictures of it, how terrible it was. And some of you have stories that you might share next Sunday night about the days of the strike. But to make a long story short, the agitation took place. International press had correspondence here. All over the world, there were people here right near the church, and the church was a lot closer to the mill, being across Franklin, than it is now. And National Guardsmen everywhere, and all sorts of stuff going on. Finally, what happened, the strikers were ousted as people eventually went back to the mill. Not many people were taken in by it, especially in this Baptist part of town, where it was made known very quickly that this was a communist, atheistic. They made no bones about it. It was communist and it was atheistic. And so most of the folks said, I don't want anything to do with that. The strike was ended, and by 1930, the trials had mostly ended. Fred Beale had fled to the Soviet Union and got disillusioned, finally came back and died in prison here. And a lot of these things took place. You can read about it in Gaston, the history room at the public library is full of the stuff. But during the whole thing, Loray Baptist Church kept on being Loray Baptist Church, right in the midst of that great firestorm that was taking place around it. What did happen after the strike, the mill owners, a lot of the mill owners, especially the Loray mill people, saw that it was a good thing that the people who worked at the people who came to Loray Baptist Church made good workers. And so they said, aha, we've got a good idea. In order to get a job at the Loray Mill, you must have the recommendation of your pastor. The guy just moved into town. He says, I got to have a job. I don't have a pastor. I got to go get to know somebody really fast. And for 10 years after this, and this was not so good of a thing, because Dr. Whitley had been one of the leaders of the pastoral opposition to the strike and preached. Get a copy of Bill Hymns and Preachers by Liston Poe if you can get beyond the northern arrogance toward the South and we ignorant folks from the textile area of the South. If you can get beyond that and read the book, you will see that Dr. Whitley is quoted, or at least alluded to quite a few times in footnotes of things that he said. And it's kind of neat because it's your church. You know, there's a book published by Yale University Press in 1940, Bill Hymns and Preachers, talks about your church and stuff that was going on all around here. And it's really a neat book. I got a copy that's just marked and underlined and highlighted, and it's a fun thing to get into every once in a while. It's a very dark, serious time. Once it was over, though, the church kept going. The Depression had come to the church, to the community, to the nation, to the world. Almost 2/3 of the 400 of the houses were vacant during the darkest days of the Depression. The mill was on a very short time. The Mantle Jeans Company declared bankruptcy. Things pretty much just weren't working, but the church kept chugging away. Membership declines and all of this. Dr. Whitley, however, had used his head. He had organized things to the point that the church was able to make the most out of the money that they were receiving. A story that was related to me is that at one time, Dr. Whitley told, during the darkest days of the Depression, he told the chairman of the Board of Deacons, he said, Mrs. Whitley and I am going to be out of town for a few days. We will not be at the deacons meeting. If you see fit, if you see a necessity for decreasing my pay, then do so. And he left. The deacons voted not to decrease his pay. I mean, you think about that, say, if he's willing to do that, we're not going to cut his pay. There was a lot of strength in Loray Baptist Church. There still is today. We need to realize, though, that this is still waters that run so deep. That is still who we are today. The Depression ground on and took its toll on our nation. But during that time, even during the darkest times, sometimes you see a glimmer of something really good. Superintendent of the Loray Mill was a member of Loray Baptist Church. At this point in time, his name was Grady Moorhead. He said, came to Dr. Whitley and said, our music could be better here. Dr. Whitley probably said, I agree. As it was said later, they were singing out of Stamps Baxter books and stuff like this, and it was books that should be used at the schoolhouse on Saturday night singing, but it was being used in the church. Mr. Moorhead knew a man who was living at that point in time in Henrietta, yeah, it's in the book. Yeah. Was living in Henrietta. They were originally from, where was it? Where were the Mosses from? Where were they originally from? Where did Mr. Moss originally come from?
Wasn't it Caroline?
He was. I think that they were from somewhere that before they were at the mills. Anyway, Mr. Moss was at Henrietta, which was a textile town at that time. He was contacted by Mr. Moorhead, brought his family and his kids here. After they got here, the seventh child was born, and that was Betty. That's in the book as well. He came in and first meeting with the choir, he said, in order to have a good choir, we've got to have good music. He said, we've got to get rid of the stuff we got here. And he was talking about Stamps Baxter type books that you still see around. And he said, it's good for a Saturday night singing at the schoolhouse, but it's not good for a church. You can look back, and Jimmy can give you a tour of the music library and show you some of the old music that from time to time the choir still sings that is very ambitious work, especially at that point in time for folks who oftentimes didn't have much above an elementary school education. And maybe a little bit beyond that. But you had folks here who were singing ambitious pieces that was real music. And Mr. Moss was a musician, and his family were musicians. And you all know those of you who have been at Loray at any point in time, you've at least heard of Mr. Moss and the impact that he has to this day. And Jimmy still hears about that's the way Mr. Moss did it. And if Mr. Moss did it that way, then it's generally good enough for Loray. So continued through this, and there was economic recovery because of the programs, the WPA, the CCC, the National Recovery Act, and some of the other three initial programs that Franklin Roosevelt, when he came into the presidency, brought with him. In 1935, the Loray Mill was purchased by the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company of Akron, Ohio. They came in and spent several $100,000 into improving the plant and the village, and the darkest days of the Depression were pretty much over at that point in time. There was a story that was told to me, though, that many of the majority of the houses were vacant, and so they had to go through and replace the walls and some of the studding. And some of the walls were the beaded board, a lot of that. The ceilings were the beaded board. They had to go into some of the houses, put new walls in, because, times are hard, and maybe there's only one person in the family working, and you got a fireplace here, and there's an empty house next door, and it's made out of what? Wood. So you burn the houses. So anyway, they had to do a lot of this work. Firestone came in, brought the mill to the level, and I've got a lot of pictures that Alvin Riley has donated to the history collection of the church. They'll be out here next week. A lot of stuff from the 50s and the early 60s that many of you will remember if you grew up in this area. But they came in and they made it a first-class operation once again. And of course, as the building was beginning to look pretty ratty. It had been added on to and added on to and added on to. My understanding is that the bell tower began to lean away from the building, and they tried to fix it, did all sorts of things to it, but gravity was winning over the wishes of the church. And so in 1939, July 25, 1939, a building fund was begun by Dr. Whitley, although he would not be at Loray to see that. He would not be living to see that. Fifth Sunday receipts from the church were deposited into the fund. He had led several other churches but would not see this happen. Reverend Wilbur Honeycutt, who was by the church not too awfully long ago, he had written some letters that we have in the history file about his recollections of the church. He was the associate pastor. He took over many of the duties of Dr. Whitley for a time, and then he went into the seminary in Louisville and became a pastor of the church there. World War II broke out again. June 10, 1941, Dr. Whitley resigned from the pastor. He ended a pastor of 16 and a half years. The things he believed in, and he demonstrated by his leadership of the church through some of the brightest days and some of the darkest days. And we probably could look at it and say that the ending days of his pastorate were the darkest days up to that point in time in the church, the history of the church. In the early days, of course, he had that exuberance that was left over from C.J. Black and all that he had added to that. He believed in training, he believed in planning, he believed in evangelism, and it worked for 16 and a half years. During the Whitley years, more than 2,300 people were added to the church, 750 by baptism. The net membership of the church, and this is a promotional flyer that was put out, the net membership of the church exceeded 1,500. The number here is received into the church, 1,535, baptized 570. But the net membership, and the high water mark for Loray Baptist Church was a membership of 1,500 people. And that was during Dr. Whitley's pastorate here. It was a time that later, as more churches were built and residential patterns were changed, it was not a number to be seen again, although it could be. Hint, hint. In October of 1941, Leonard Monroe Dixon, who was, I believe, in Loray, North Carolina, as a pastor, accepted the call to become pastor of Loray Baptist Church. And some of you remember him. He might have married some of you. He married my mom and daddy. And he was the pastor during World War II. Although, and somebody can correct me if I'm incorrect, according to the records, he accepted the pastorate before Pearl Harbor, but did not come until early 42. So when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Loray was without a pastor. They probably had a supply pastor, or the church, as strong as it was running itself. But according to what I can determine, and that's what the book says as well. But he came here and he found the community buzzing once again. He came in and the mill was running, I don't know, did the mill ever run 7 days?
Yeah.
Did it run 7 days during the war? It was running all the time. It was kicking out products for Loray. The Firestone Mill won the Army Navy E Excellence Production Award, and we've got the program where that was presented by some military higher-ups at the mill during that time. And it's, as it states in here, it's ironic that later the Japanese wound up owning Bridgestone Firestone. But anyway, the community was there were people in uniform everywhere. This was I would imagine hanging somewhere, but it's a very patriotic, very God and country sort of picture that just one of many things that was saved out of musty, dusty rooms, and no telling what stuff disappeared before we got to these. But this is the World War II vintage print that evokes all of the virtues and all of the things for which we were fighting. Reverend Dixon came into this community, this setting, found that things were happening everywhere. It was a time of patriotism. It was a time that everyone was behind the effort that was taking place to win the war. And the community was behind that. The church was without many of its young people. The church was without, but as it had done to a lesser degree in World War I, the church was continuing, and many people during World War II were trained to lead in the church who otherwise possibly would not have received this training, because many of the folks who had been leadership people were off in service. The church continued, was very strong during this time. It was there was a patriotic spirit in the church. And although Reverend Dixon, L.M. Dixon, was not the dynamic sort of pastor, it seems like if God doesn't provide a dynamic man, looking back on the history of the church, God makes up for it by providing dynamic times. And so the fact that Reverend Dixon was not the same, he wasn't a C.J. Black, he wasn't a Julius Abernathy, he was who he was. But the church was strong, and these were times that people came to church, and it was a time that folks were behind the church and patriotism. Things have taken place in the church. A banner once again hung in the Berean class. No, we don't know where it is. It might be with the fish. I don't know. But the banner's somewhere, unless it was burned when the old building was torn down. With all the people who were serving in war service. Troop 9, Boy Scouts, furnished uniformed ushers once a month for the church to keep that patriotic feeling going. In July of 1943, Kermit Parker, who had been a member of Troop 9, and one of the windows, and I meant to do this before tonight, one of the windows is in memory of Kermit Parker, and he was killed in the war in July of 1943. He was the son of Mr. and Mrs. W.K. Parker. During the war, the church negotiated with Firestone for a piece of property to relocate the church on, knowing that the church was sort of falling apart, the building was, and that they needed more space for a nicer, more modern building. Loray, if you'll recall last week, Loray had helped with the organization of South Marietta Street, of Ranlow, and during the Second World War in 1942, gave assistance to a group that became West Franklin, which ironically was the original name of this church when one of the names that they went under before Loray Mill gave them property. West Franklin Avenue also gave assistance to a church that had been sponsored by Temple Baptist, which had been sponsored by Loray in the 20s, and that was Beach Avenue. And so Beach Avenue led L.J. Waldrop in 1954 when he wrote a sketch history of Loray Baptist Church to call Loray a grandmother of Baptist churches, because it had given birth to churches who in turn had given birth to churches. And then in 1944, a group that was meeting in West Gastonia, which was called the West Gastonia Prayer Band, a church to be if it be God's will. Well, we helped them, and Reverend Dixon is in that church's church history as one of the movers, and although he was not tremendously dynamic as a speaker and did not do the C.J. Black and the Whitley things, he did help in the organization of the church at Lake McCain Unity Baptist Church. So that was another thing that Loray folks can be proud of, that we have had some assistance in creating some of these other churches. As the war wound down and the new churches began, which was a sort of a prophetic statement of things that were going to take place. May 7th, DE Day, September 2nd, VJ Day. Once again, mill whistles were everywhere. I don't think, it's not listed, it's not mentioned in the newspapers, that people were out shooting weapons out in the streets as they were at the end of World War I. Great celebrations, and you either remember it or you've seen pictures or movies or newsreels of VE Day and VJ Day. Many changes following World War II. There was a group of young people, and I was going through a chronological listing of historic events the other night. A big thick thing put out during the bicentennial, and it showed newspaper articles mentioning that when the Germans surrendered, that there were going to be 2 million service people discharged, and plans for an additional 6 million to be shifted to the Pacific Theater to fight the Japanese. Tremendous numbers of young people coming back to this country. Then when the Japanese surrendered, tremendous numbers of people created economic problems. You had, for instance, Firestone running 7 days a week. Ford Motor Company, Willow Run plant producing bombers. Everything that you can think of had shifted over into war production, had government contracts. All of a sudden, those things were running out. There was no need for bombers anymore. There were no need for uniforms. There were no need for all these things. And so what you had the beginning, the trickle first, and then the torrent of young people coming back. They were to change the nation, and it would never be the same again, because how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Perry? How are things going to be the same when all these folks from all these textile villages and all these industrial towns and all these farms had gone and seen everything, and had seen death and destruction, and had seen powers greater than anyone could ever imagine, and then came back home? They didn't come back home as little Johnny and little Frank and little whatever. They came back as somebody altogether different, because they had seen things. They had grown up in a relatively short period of time. Government housing was built where, and it's sort of dating myself when I say where Todd Field is. Well, Todd Field's not there. Where the YMCA soccer field is now, that area had government apartments for people to live in, and also on Overhill Drive, according to some maps, there's a mention of a government housing project that was over there. In some of the pictures, some of the aerial photographs you'll see next week, you can see that government housing there. And all these people coming in. Residential patterns changed. The suburbs all over the country just began to just cover the farms. Farms were disappearing outside of big cities and small towns. And suburban places, a serviceman could come in and buy a house, get a VA loan, no money down, and go out there and pretty well get themselves started. And the GI Bill provided for education. And you have people who came in and as young people dealt with the Great Depression. And then, as they were reaching the time where they ought to be getting married and doing all the things to build their lives, they were called off to war. They came back with all that pent-up desire to be regular. And they came back and it just cut loose. And as a result, as we'll see next week, the 50s changed everything. Reverend Dixon led the church. During the war, during this difficult time, he indicated that he was going to resign effective June 30, 1947. And please pardon me, I will admit it now, and you can strike it out of future references, future histories, but since nobody else wrote it in 1978, nobody else wanted to write it, they said, Tim, you write it. So I took the liberty of mentioning this, and I just want to say it just because I love my mom and daddy, and I will just let you know this, and if you get mad at me, that's okay, we can delete it from future histories. But it says that he continued faithfully carrying out his duties until his time of resignation, performing a marriage ceremony on June 22nd, and preaching the final Sunday of his pastorate, June 29, 1947. That's my mom and dad. I'm sorry. I just slipped that past. If you want to delete it from future, because a lot of y'all got married back in that time. So if you want to, or we can just add a page and put all your wedding. Okay, well, I hope you forgive me for that. During this time, although he was not the C.J. Black and the J.W. Whitley kind of pastor, he led the church through a very difficult time. His wife was ill during this time, which probably hindered the effectiveness of his pastor. He led the church and continued. And sometimes it's necessary for someone just to be there to steady the helm until the ship comes through the storm. And that's what, if anything, that's what Reverend Dixon did. He steadied the helm until the church could come through the storm and come out into post-war peace and prosperity. Next week, we will begin with the post-war period. On September 28, 1947, Loray extended the pastoral call to Dr. Frank H. Malone, who was the pastor of the Madison Avenue Baptist Church in Covington, Kentucky at that point in time. He was born in Lumberton, North Carolina. He went to Wake Forest and studied law, but while he was studying law, he felt a call to preach. Received his BA. I'm going to get a head start on next week. I hope you all mind this. Received his BA degree from Wake Forest, his master's and his PhD from the Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And he pastored churches in Indiana and Kentucky while he was in the seminary. He came to the church November 25, 1947. And as L.J. Waldrop says in his 1954 history, he says he found a fellowship which was united and cooperative in spirit. And I don't think there's a better place that we could stop tonight and let me leave you with those words. A fellowship which was united and cooperative in spirit. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Tim's talking about deleting that from the next history that's written. What he doesn't know is he's going to be writing the next history. So it'll be up to him whether or not he wants to believe it or not. Thank you so much, Tim. Please, gosh, it's good to see all of you here tonight. Maybe I can just preach too, Tim. You got this, maybe get an offering. Who was it that took up all the money? Black. It was Black the one that got the money straight there. With a leaky roof? Hey, we voted on the roof, you know. We're going to get that recovered. It's good to see all of you here. It's good to be here. Please come back next Sunday morning. Bring somebody with you for our big time next Sunday morning. Cover this lunch in the fall, and then the final session of the history next Sunday night. And then an opportunity afterwards for you to share some of the wonderful memories that you have of our church and community as well. Let's bow together for our closing prayer. Father, we are so grateful that you are with us, that you have been with us through the years, through the high moments, Lord, of spiritual excitement, through those dark valleys, Lord, through which our church has walked. We give you thanks that you have been our God through all, and that, Lord, you continue to be present with us today as we continue, Lord, to seek to surrender ourselves to your will, as to be the people you want us to be for our day and for the days that lie ahead, which will be your day. Bless us, Lord, as we go from this place with your blessing and with your grace. We offer you our prayer in the name of Christ. Amen. Thanks for being here.